Next, to discuss the historical origins of Hinduphobia within the British Raj, I would like to invite on-screen Professor Arvind Sharma. Formerly of the IAS, Arvind Sharma is the Burks Professor of Comparative Religion in the School of Religious Studies at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He has also taught in Australia and the USA, including at Harvard University, and has published extensively in the fields of comparative religion and Indology. He was instrumental through 3 global conferences in facilitating the adaptation of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the world's religions. His recent books include Religious Tolerance, A History, The Ruler's Gaze, a study of the British rule over India from a Sadian perspective, Gandhi, a spiritual biography, Hinduism and its sense of history, and Decolonizing Indian Studies. He has contributed to and edited Our Religions, the 7 world religions introduced by preeminent scholars from each tradition. He is also the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Indian Religions. Professor Sharma will first give a brief talk on this subject, followed by a question and answer session with our discussant for the session, Parth Parihar. Please give a warm HSC welcome to Professor Arvind Sharma.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. So let me begin by thanking you all for this invitation, and for apologizing to you for the way I look, my unkempt look. I've been told that I look younger than I am, and so to correct that, I've decided to grow a beard. With that remark, I launch out on the historical roots of Indophobia. I'll say what I have to say in 4 parts. In the first part, I'll make some remarks on the definition of the term Hinduphobia in a way which is relevant to what we are going to discuss. In the second part, I shall identify the historical roots of Hinduphobia in what we in our academia, in our academic jargon, like to describe as diachronic view of the whole thing. And then in the third part, I'll take what is regarded as a synchronic view, an overall view of the roots, the historical roots, how those roots become ingredients in the modern attitudes. And finally, I shall try to suggest some ways of dealing with the situation, taking my cue from the previous talks. Okay. So the first point I'd like to make regarding the definition is to focus on the word phobia. Now, what is a phobia and how is it different from fear? Phobia is usually considered or defined even as an irrational fear of something. So normally we have no problem with drinking water, but a person suffering from rabies is afraid of doing so. Irrational fear. Now, in this context, a very well-known Hindu trope of mistaking a rope for a snake is very helpful. Many of you may be aware of this trope. Basically, the setting is that, say, some students are returning at the end of the term after a beer bash to their hostel, and they see a rope. One of them sees a coiled rope lying in a corner, and because of his or her inebriated state, mistakes it for a snake. Now, seeing the snake in the rope is the phobic element. It is irrational. If there is really a snake, it is not phobia. It is a cause for genuine alarm. The phobic element is that it is not really a snake. If one knows the facts, the sense of panic recedes. If somebody points out to the student, maybe a friend of his, that look, this is a rope. So the Hinduphobic representation of Hinduism aims at precisely this: generation of a sense of alarm when it is not justified. For instance, calling any assertion of rights by Hindus, and not just calling but dubbing it as fascism, would be an example here. And please note that there are two aspects to the situation. When the rope is mistaken for a snake, two things happen. The real nature or character of the thing is obscured. The rope is not seen as a rope. The technical word used in Hindu philosophy for that is avaran, concealment. And a false character is projected into it. That is the snake. And again, the technical word for this is vikshep in Indian thought. The fact that more than 90,000 Hindu temples are run in the 5 southern states of India by the state governments is covered up. How many of us know this fact? And the demand that Hindus want to run their own temples is then depicted as fascist. While all that is being demanded is that India be what it claims to be, a secular state, in which the state leaves religion alone, so long as it does not violate the law of the land. So this is the first remark I would like to make on the term Hinduphobia. The second is that I think we might usefully distinguish in certain contexts between Hinduphobia and Hindumissia. I'm not questioning the formulation of the definition of Hinduphobia, which includes hatred of Hinduism as a part of Hinduphobia. But what I'm suggesting is that if we distinguish between the sentiments of hatred and fear, then we gain analytically. In the sense that the fear can be removed by removing the basis for it. This is especially important for us in the academia because we deal with the rational side of the human personality. And Hinduphobia is an irrational fear of Hinduism. So if we can move, or we can rather use rationality to counter that irrationality, that irrational fear, we may be taking our first step towards combating Hinduphobia. Hatred has deeper psychological issues associated with it. Okay. The third point I would like to make in our discussion of Hinduphobia is the distinction between motive and fact. What I'm trying to say is that, and this is connected with my previous point, even if a person who hates Hinduism may make a statement about Hinduism which is correct, and if we only judge people by their motive, then we will miss out on this fact. Especially as academics, our first concern should be to determine whether a statement made is true or false, right or wrong, inaccurate or accurate. I think we have a genuine choice to make here in how we decide to deal with Hinduphobia. We can include the motive of the statement being made about Hinduism in a particular context within the purview of Indophobia. And on other occasions, we can exclude the motive and only look at the truth value of the statement. As an academic, I am very sensitive to the distinction between credibility and truth. What do I mean by that? Suppose we are having a conference in a room which is covered from all sides, and we cannot check the weather outside from inside the room. Suppose a person who is known to us to be a liar comes and says it is raining outside. What do we do? Do we dismiss this statement because we know this person is a liar? Or do we take the position that he may or may not be a liar? He has made a statement, and the validity of that statement does not depend on the person making it being honest or dishonest. Its validity depends on its correspondence to truth. That is, we should never conflate credibility and truth. Or rather, credibility with truth. Excuse me. The fourth point I would like to make is that Hinduphobia may not be restricted to non-Hindus. Example, in the 1960s, K.N. Raj, a very well-known Indian economist of the time, described the low rate of economic growth in India as the Hindu rate of growth. This is totally unwarranted. But just because the word Hindu had a negative association in the secular circles he was probably moving in, he decided to call it the Hindu rate of growth. In fact, actually, the remark also becomes facetious in the light of the fact that Angus Madison, in his well-known history of economic development of the world, points out that from the year from 100 AD to 1500 AD, India has the largest share of global output. In 1600, China marched ahead. In 1700, India regained the lead. But by 1900, India's share had fallen from about 25% to less than 2%. This is during the period of British rule. Why did not they not call it the socialist rate of growth? No, they called it the Hindu rate. Okay, that completes the first part. Now, in the second part, I'd like to now trace the historical roots of Hinduphobia. Since the term is largely associated these days with the interface between India and the West, I think it is worth pointing out that when India faced the West before the modern times, that is in the form of its encounter with Greece and the Greeks, the Greeks had no Hinduphobia, to the best of my knowledge. I mention this because the modern West traces its lineage, at least its philosophical lineage, to Greece. So it's the modern West which has a problem with Hindu-India. Now, the first element in the appearance of Hinduphobia may be identified with the coming of the Portuguese. And with the coming of the Portuguese, we have the appearance of Christianity as a source of Hinduphobia. Because according to Christianity, the Hindus are heathens. The great distinction between us and them is highlighted straight away. Now, when Vasco da Gama was asked, what has he come to India for? He said, enigmatically, to a certain extent, for Christians and spices. Now, I want to ask you a question which might seem irrelevant to begin with. How many of you have been to a Christian mass or the Eucharist? If not, then please do not miss the opportunity. Because if you do so, you will get an idea by the extent you are appalled by what you see happening in the Christian mass, of how the Christians must have reacted when they encountered our rites and rituals. Because you will find the Christians eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Jesus Christ. How is it different from cannibalism? The point I'm trying to make is that one should take a somewhat humanistic view of Hinduphobia also. As a normally vegetarian Hindu, you might feel so outraged by what you see in the Christian ceremony. That you will have to make a conscious effort to familiarize yourself with Christianity, to understand, and then gradually to appreciate what is really going on. So we should never lose sight of our humanism in all this. But here we have the first element, historical, in Hinduphobia, the Christian element. comes in with the Portuguese and continues for the rest of our encounter, or of India's encounter with the West. The most glaring example of this form of Hinduphobia, if I take the word swastik, what is the first association you have with that word now? The first association which comes to mind, probably the Nazis. Well, the Nazis never used that word. They always called it a hooked cross. Why was it called a swastika? Or is called a swastika? When it's tempted to attribute this to Indophobia rooted in Christianity. In fact, it is more than that. It is deflecting the blame onto Hindus. Then the next major European power we had to deal with, the British. With British, we have another ingredient coming to the fore in Indophobia, and that is race. In 1757, Clive famously won the Battle of Plassey. But right there, after the battle, he sort of gloated that most of the people who on his side who died in the battle were blacks, and only a few whites lost their lives. So you have the racial element right at the very inception of British rule in India. And we have it throughout the history of British rule. We have, of course, still the memory. The memories are still fresh in many minds, including the mind of a colleague of mine, who has himself seen boards like dogs in India not allowed. We know how important the racial element was in the suppression of the mutiny. And after that, even in the time of Churchill, we have Churchill describing Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion, and sending a telegram to the Viceroy. Why is Gandhi not dead yet? I think in 1944. And then you have the Harry and Meghan episode more recently in Britain. So the British encounter, we have the race element also now, along with the Christian element. Now, what would be a glaring example of Hinduphobia based on race? I refer here to the alien invasion theory. Which is often treated as a fact in the literature on the subject. Now, I'm not going into the debate about the way alien invasion took place or not. This is a very contested terrain. And according to one scholar who actually works at Rutgers, Professor Edwin Bryant, the evidence is too close to call. That is, too closely contested to call either way, as he argues in his well-known book, The Quest for the Origin of Vedic Culture. I leave it at that. What I want to draw attention to is the fact that the distinctions described in the Vedas, especially the Rig Veda, between the Aryans and the non-Aryans, who are usually identified as the Dasas and the Dasyas, was nowhere treated before the coming of the British as racial in character. It was always treated as cultural. That is why Indra at one place could say in the Rig Veda that I will make the Aryas into Dasas and Dasas into Aryas. It's like saying, if you make it racial, I can make blacks whites and whites blacks. It won't happen biologically. But if the differences are cultural, it can happen. So I would find Hinduphobic element in trying to identify differences which have been treated in our own literature, our meaning the Hindu literature, as cultural, as racial. When a scholar of the standing of Professor P.V. Kane, magisterial work yeah, on the Hindu law is very well known. And he points out that all the descriptive terms which highlight the differences between the two groups are capable of being explained culturally. So the attempt to explain them racially, I would consider potentially Indophobic. Then, of course, both Portugal and Britain are parts of Europe. And British conquest of India was a part of the general European expansion over the rest of the world. And so we have a third source of Indophobia apart from the Christian, which I highlighted beginning with the Portuguese, then the race, the British, and now a certain Eurocentrism as an element enters Hinduphobia, find a place in Hinduphobia. And a glaring example of this would be the fact that the European concept of religion has been used to narrow the semantic field of the word dharma. What I mean by that is that in the European imagination, a person can only follow one religion at a time. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all the three religions believe in one God. But you can't be a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim at the same time. Hinduism as one religious tradition has not one but hundreds of gods. Is the counterexample to the idea that one can only follow one religion at a time. And yet, we have been adopting that European meaning under the influence of our exposure to Europe. So, We have first our encounter with the Portuguese, and that brings in the element of Christianity in Hinduphobia. Then we have our encounter with the British, and that highlights the element of race. And then we have our encounter with Europe in general, and that highlights the element of Eurocentrism. Should Indian reality be changed to conform to the linguistic, or more precisely, to the semantic conventions of Europe? And any attempt to change that position will be dubbed communal in India. This again I see as containing an element of Indophobia. Okay. Now, what I want to point out next is the third part of it, that we can, these three elements whose contribution to Hinduphobia we have diachronically analyzed. First the Portuguese, then the British, and then Europe in general. Also can now be looked upon synchronically as the three ingredients of Hinduphobia. That is, Hinduphobia has a Christocentric element, has a race-centered element. I like to avoid the word racist as too loaded for our purposes, and a Eurocentric element. Now, I would now like to identify the unexpected and undetected implications of how these elements have unfolded. For instance, do we realize that the reason why we are conversing at the moment in English has a Christocentric element? We are discussing Hinduphobia in English. This has a Christocentric element in it. How many of us know that when English was being introduced in India in 1835, Macaulay wrote a letter to his father that if our scheme succeed, within 30 years, not a single idolater will be left in Bengal. The schemes here meaning the schemes of introducing English. One of the reasons which Macaulay never states in public, but one of the hopes he harbored in private was that by introducing English, he was an evangelical. He would convert India to Christianity. Similarly, how many of us realize that the British tried to explain the caste system in terms of race? Especially in the second half of the 19th century, through the various censuses. And then how the Eurocentric element affects the situation. After the appearance of Charles Darwin's famous work, The Origin of the Species, around the middle of the 19th century, evolution became the dominant trope in Western thought. And so they tried to explain almost everything in terms of religion. Not just the origin of the species, That is how the various forms of life appeared, but also various forms of social life, religious life, and so on. In the field of religion, the view took root that in the beginning there was polydemonism, then there was polytheism, then there was henotheism, then there was monotheism, evolution and progress. And the hold of this idea of evolution on the Western mind was so strong at the time that when they came to the Vedas, they could not believe that monotheism, these various forms of theism, could simultaneously exist in the Hindu religious imagination. I'm using the word Hindu anachronistically. And therefore, if you read the Vedas, it's so obvious that they are now saying in the early hymns, this is polytheism. And then there is henotheism in the Brahmana portion of the Vedas. And when you come to the Upanishads, there is monotheism. So, all these three can be pursued independently as currents, which explain certain aspects of our life. Now, of course, they can also combine. For instance, Christocentrism and Eurocentrism is a very interesting combination. If I say the word Angkor Wat, that well-known religious site in Cambodia, most of the readers who are aware of it would associate it with Hinduism. And yet, when it was first discovered, there was a functioning Buddhist order on the site of the Vishnu temple or Hindu temple, quoted. How is this relevant to us? How is this fact relevant for us? Himanshu Prabhare has pointed out that when the early Western scholars came in contact with these sites and found that they were sacred to both the Hindus, the Buddhists, and the Jains in India or elsewhere, they attributed it to the non-rationality. I'm trying to avoid using the word irrationality of the Asians. The more rational West is going to parcel them out into these various religions. So the natives are all confused. So here we have a combination of Christian sense of superiority combined with the European confidence and rationality. We will tell them what their religion is. Angkor Wat is only Hindu. And the Sangha was meant to pack up. This is very serious because it shows that what we are trying to discuss, Hinduphobia and similar attitudes, have actually shaped reality, what we think is real now. It has not. Scholarship is supposed to reflect reality, as I said. Historically describe things as they are. This happened in the case of the censuses, but that's a different story. So here we have a combination of two currents displaying themselves. And then, of course, all three, Christianity, racism, and Eurocentrism, were used to justify British rule over India. So this covers the third part. And so I come to the final part of what to do about it. Now, as I see it, we can look at this in two ways. We can look at this in the short run and in the long run. That is, look at the ways of combating Hinduphobia. And we can also look at what we can do individually to combat it and what we can do collectively. And of course, our conference today is a very good example of this collective endeavor. Okay, so individually, in the short run, I would say that we can do a couple of things on our own. One, to prepare a reading list. Okay, let me preface what I'm going to say, my conviction. Again, on relying on rationality, that Hinduphobia is an irrational fear of Hinduism. And one way of combating it, and most congenial to us as academics, would be a rational approach. That is to say, by providing the evidence which goes against that irrationality, we'll be able to convince people to abandon their, or rather to change their position. So one way of doing that would be to have a reading list when we are discussing these issues. Look, you have your position, I have my position. I'd like to know more about your position. Please let me know what I can read upon. And here's what you can read upon to understand my position better, which we can share. Second thing would be to stand up by leveling the playing field. I'll give you 3 examples of how this could be done. Somebody is using dowry, not as a legitimate criticism of Hindu social practices, but as an expression of Hinduphobia. What can we do? We can point out that the analog to dowry in Hinduism, Hindu society, is date rape in Western society. Yes, when I first mentioned this in a conference, everybody was shocked. How? Dowry is the pathology of a system of selecting partners in which the marriage is arranged by the parents. It gets commodified. It gets commodified. And date rape is the pathology of a system of choosing partners in which the choice is left to the partners themselves. This level is the playing field of the discussion. When Hinduism is accused of idolatry, other religions can be accused of bibliolatry, worshipping a book. Third example, caste. I can't go into detail here on this, but I've argued elsewhere that the caste system is the Western nation-state system deterritorialized. And the nation-state system is the caste system territorialized. What I mean by that is that the main features of jati, caste, sense of jati, are endogamy, marrying among your own people, interdining, social circle of your own, process of your own cohort, from your own cohort, and craft exclusiveness. Well, people in a nation state, whom do they marry? A fellow citizen. Whom do they mix with? A fellow citizen. What are they known for? Germany is known for technology. Britain was known for diplomacy. America is known for business. So I don't have the time to go into this in detail. But at the risk of some immodesty, let me mention the fact that I've elaborated this in a book which bears the title, One Religion Too Many. There's a whole chapter on this. So this is the second way. We can have a reading list and we can have our arguments to level the playing field, because then the element of condescension is removed in the discussion. And the third step we could take individually is that we could insist that the terminology used to describe Indian social reality or Hindu social reality should be our own. Sati should never be referred to as widow murder. Should be referred to as sati. Never as homicide or suicide. Why is this important? Or we should use the word dharma, not religion, for reasons I just hinted at. We should use the words varna and jati, not caste. The word caste conflates these two terms. So we must insist that one terms are used. Let me just give you an illustration of the power of this. Through a hypothetical example. Suppose it was India which conquered Britain, and not Britain which conquered India. This is not as far-fetched as it seems. In 1600, if you had asked historians, these two countries have just come in closer contact. If ever a situation, or if ever such a situation develops, which country is more likely to rule over the other? The chances are that half the historians have said India or Britain. This is India under Akbar and Britain under Elizabeth. First, how would we have justified our conquest of Britain? Remember that at that time when this happens, they are all practicing the rite of circumcision. We would have called them that genital mutilation. We would have described circumcision as genital mutilation, painted the Britishers as uncivilized, morbid people, and stopped it and said, now we have abolished sati, our version of sati. Just by calling it genital mutilation. Okay. Now let me now switch to the collective level and in the longer run. And here I have just two suggestions. One is that we should collect as many examples of bias and error, of Hinduphobia, let's put it that way, and have a data bank so that when we claim that this phenomenon exists and somebody doubts it, we can present really convincing evidence. There's no reasonable person would be able to dismiss. So that's one. And the second suggestion is that we should petition the government of India to appoint a commission to report to it on Hinduphobia in the Western media and academia. Because the first step in institutional remedying of this, which will leave the long-term solution, has to be an institutional recognition of this phenomenon. And if this commission is able to establish Indophobia as a phenomenon, as phenomena which must be investigated and corrected, and that is having a baleful influence, can no longer seriously be doubted from what we have been seeing recently. But that's at a personal level. This will be at a collective and governmental level. But I'm not presuming that the commission will confirm what our impression is. But it well might. It will also make us more confident, or more convinced at least, that our reactions are not merely visceral, but objective, not merely subjective, but have an objective basis. But in doing so, I have two caveats to mention. Lessons from the great Mahatma Gandhi, when he tried to point out to the British that there is such a thing as exploitation of the masses. First response was the same as to Hinduphobia. Dismissal. No, we have the good of the world public in mind. What did Gandhi do? First thing, he documented cases of exploitation. Affidavits. His first move against the British was in Champaran. And what did he do there? Sworn affidavits from all the tenants who came to complain to him. And he sifted them after investigating them. Any affidavit which tested the bounds of credibility was removed. And impersonal. Don't blame individual British officers or the British officers in the district. This is the great distinction, the great thing Mahatma Gandhi has taught us. Our opponent is not necessarily our enemy. I hark back to the humanism I mentioned earlier. You also commit mistakes. You also have biases. So, the well-known Christian saying, hate the sin, not the sinner, has to be invoked. It should be impersonal, and it should be fully documented and free from hatred. That is why I was insisting on our recognizing phobia, the distinction between misia and phobia, hatred and fear. Now time has come to conclude. So I'll do that by just drawing attention to two things. One, the fact that when James Mill published his well-known work, I've had 3 years for its publication by now in my readings, 1817, 1818, and 1819, A History of British India, which is his famous Philippic against Hinduism. Already when it appeared, articles in English challenging its conclusions and its evidence started appearing in India. So that the battle we are engaged in is a long drawn one.
Thank you, Professor Sharma, for that wonderful talk. Now, just in the last 5 minutes, I'd like to ask some questions that I hope will help crystallize many of the amazing ideas that you've presented to our audience through your talk today. It's a great pleasure to be able to interact with you, even for a short amount of time. So I think the one question that I really wanted to focus on a lot, putting your talk in the context of what Professor Long was talking about, is this question of why you believe we can draw a straight line from the historical trends you've spoken about in your talk, the use of Christianity, race, Eurocentrism, these three strands in propagating Hinduphobia within the British Raj and the Portuguese as well. Why do you think we can draw a straight line between manufacturing the justification of the colonization of India using these Hinduphobic tropes with contemporary Hinduphobia? So in what way is this a continuous historical trend?
Well, it's kind of very good point, very good question. And thanks for asking it, because it helps to clarify both the continuity and the difference between pre-independence and post-independence manifestations of Indophobia. All the three elements which we identified earlier in the talk, the Christocentrism, the racial element, and then the Eurocentrism, are ongoing currents. Christians are still trying to convert us. Europeans are still insisting that Indian philosophy is not philosophy. Hindu philosophy certainly is not philosophy, because it has never separated itself from religion. And the less said about the race, the better, I guess, with Rashmi Sawant and other cases staring us in the face. So these are the elements of continuity. The difference is that the texture, the vehemence has a different quality to it. And let me explain this. In the 1930s, when Mahatma Gandhi's movement launched through the Salt March, right? The Gandhi March, Salt Satyagraha. I think 1930, he was the Times Man of the Year in 31, Mahatma Gandhi, right? So the Indian struggle for independence had become internationalized and so on. So that's when the Hinduphobic element got intensified. That's when the Mother India of Catherine Mayo was published. That is when the threat becomes real. Your biases get intensified. Now, what is happening is that the threat is becoming real, which had not been faced so far by the West, just as it had not been faced. The prospect of actual Indian independence only appeared on the horizon around the 30s. Okay. So that gives us, that both links us up with the past and also enables us to see how there's a period of intensification. Now, what has happened now is that the prospect of actual political power being exercised by Hindus is becoming a possibility after the success of the BJP, depending on how long lasting it is. That is why it is intensifying. But there's another element in it, which is the most serious one. And that is that the perspective of Hinduism look upon it as an exercise in piety, violence or non-violence, virtue or vice, good or bad. And this is also true of the Hindus themselves. our own perception of Hinduism is in terms of piety. Am I a good Hindu, bad Hindu? And that would consist of, do I eat meat or not, and things like that, do I hurt people and things like that. Now, for the first time, both within Hinduism and it's also been perceived outside Hinduism, the acid test is including the consideration of power, not just piety. And of course, power is a zero-sum game. Piety is not.
Yes, that's a very important point. And thank you for answering that question, because I think it's an important thing that helps bring the whole thing together. The one thing I wanted to say in closing on your session was you mentioned having a reading list for people to be able to, collect resources about understanding Hinduphobia. And I think one of the best resources is actually your book, The Ruler's Gaze. This is a study of British rule over India from a Sadian perspective. This book details in meticulous detail all of the tropes that the British used, why they were used, when they were used, what the motives were behind them. And I think it's a really important work for us to all read. So I wanted to thank you for all the work that you've done already in this field, and for being here with us today.
It was an honor for me to be part of this, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you both so much for that stimulating question and answer session. Professor Sharma, we are truly in awe of the work that you have done in academia and in Hindu studies. We cannot adequately express our gratitude for your presence at our conference here today, and many thanks.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.